We went down in the lift to the ground floor and made our way through the reading room to the lounge. And there, sure enough, sat Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins in a couple of armchairs, with a low, round, glass-covered table between them. There were several other groups in there as well, but the Jenkinses were the only couple sitting alone. Mr. Jenkins was reading a newspaper. Mrs. Jenkins was knitting something large and mustard-coloured. Only my nose and eyes were above the clasp of my grandmother's handbag, but I had a super view. I could see everything. My grandmother, dressed in black lace, went thumping across the floor of the lounge and halted in front of the Jenkinses' table. "Are you Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins?" she asked. Mr. Jenkins looked at her over the top of his newspaper and frowned. "Yes," he said, "I am Mr. Jenkins. What can I do for you, madam?" "I'm afraid I have some rather alarming news for you," she said. "It's about your son, Bruno." "What about Bruno?" Mr. Jenkins said. Mrs. Jenkins looked up, but went on knitting. "What's the little blighter been up to now?" Mr. Jenkins asked. "Raiding the kitchen, I suppose?" "It's a bit worse than that," my grandmother said. "Do you think we might go somewhere more private while I tell you about it?" "Private?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Why do we have to be private?" "This is not an easy thing for me to explain," my grandmother said. "I'd much rather we all went up to your room and sat down before I tell you any more." Mr. Jenkins lowered his paper. Mrs. Jenkins stopped knitting. "I don't want to go up to my room, madam," Mr. Jenkins said. "I'm quite comfortable here, thank you very much." He was a large, coarse man, and he wasn't used to being pushed around by anybody. "Kindly state your business, and then leave us alone," he added. He spoke as though he was addressing someone who was trying to sell him a vacuum cleaner at the back door. My poor grandmother, who had been doing her best to be as kind to them as possible, now began to bristle a bit herself. "We really can't talk in here," she said. "There are too many people. This is a rather delicate and personal matter."